Hi, I'm Professor Engelhardt, and we're continuing our series here on the principles of macroeconomics with money and banking. And so the questions we're going to look at are, well, what is money? How do we measure money? And then also, what is the connection, right, between money and banking that we would always feel a need to put these things together? Right, so in answering these questions, we're going to first look at money's functions and origin to get a sense of what it is. Then we'll look at how we measure money, the various ways we do that. And then finally, the connection between money and the banking system. To really understand why we have money, we need to think about a world without money. Now, in such a world, for us to get the things that we want, right, any goods that we have will have to be traded directly for the goods that we want, right? So that means then that, uh, say, I would be trading to you, say, a pair of shoes, so in turn, you can give me bread or whatever it happens to be. Now, there are a couple issues that show up with this barter-based economy. One of those is what we call the double coincidence of wants, which is just to say that in order for a trade to happen, it must be that I have the thing you want and you have the thing I want, right? So, as we say, it's a rather silly example, but it's if you are a chicken having pickle wanter, you need to find a chicken wanting pickle haver in order for this trade to occur. And that naturally can be very difficult, especially as societies get more complex and we have a greater variety of goods available. It's for this reason we would expect that barter economies would generally stay fairly simple. We wouldn't imagine them having a huge variety of goods available simply because it's really, really hard to engage in trades with really specialized goods. A second problem we run into is the problem of divisibility. That is, getting units right can be really tricky. So say, for example, that I want 2 loaves of bread. Well, do I provide you with half a shoe? After all, in a whole pair of shoes sounds like it's a bit much, right, for just 2 loaves of bread, right? So trying to get this right is an issue. After all, there are certain goods where when you divide them, they stop being the same good, right? So two half cows are not the same thing as a whole cow. What this means then is that any kind of trade that might happen between a high value good and a low value good gets really tricky simply because divisibility becomes a problem for the higher valued goods. So, because of the problems with barter, we then have a transition that happens in the economy to using a medium of exchange. And this is really the origin of money. So, medium of exchange, by definition, is just something that you use to acquire something else where you aren't planning to use that thing, right? So this is a process that we call indirect exchange. So this is probably easiest seen in a modern example. I exchange my work, right, to the university, who in turn pays me a paycheck. I don't particularly want the money itself. I don't have like some kind of fetish for cash or anything like that. Instead, the reason that I want it is that then I can trade that money to get something else, right? So this is a medium of exchange. So medium we know is between things. So we have these two different exchanges happening. We have my labor for money and then money for the various goods that I want for bread. So in that case, we have money exists as a medium of exchanges in between these two other things. But another way, this is an indirect exchange. That is, I am exchanging my labor to get bread, but I'm not doing so directly. I'm instead working partway between. Then what happens is the medium of exchange tends to spread throughout the economy and create what we call network effects. So that is, once somebody uses something as a medium of exchange, what that does is make that good more acceptable, which then makes it more attractive to others as a medium of exchange. So, say, using bread as an example, if I know that I am in an economy where lots of people will consume bread, or at least will accept it in exchange, that gives me a reason to also accept it in exchange, even if I myself cannot eat bread, say it makes me ill or something like that. Right, so in that case, I nonetheless would be willing to accept it just so that I can pass it off to somebody else. So this is where the network effect comes in. The network effect is simply something that becomes an effect that becomes stronger the more people use it, and that is exactly what happens with the medium of exchange. We also see network effects with lots of other things, like language does this. The more somebody uses a word, the more useful the word tends to be, right? And the same thing happens with money. The more there are people using exactly the same medium of exchange, the more useful that particular medium of exchange is in its use. So the way that we define money then, right, is that money is a commonly accepted medium of exchange, right? So it's something where I'm reasonably confident that if I go into an exchange with a person and I offer them this thing, then they are willing to accept that thing. It may be a matter of negotiating the price, but at the very least, we don't have to change the means of payment that I'm using. So yeah, I know that anybody in the United States will accept dollars, but question of how many dollars is a fair question, but dollars will be accepted. But so then what are the functions of money? First, the primary function is that money is the medium of exchange, the most commonly accepted medium of exchange. Now, I would note that it is not the only medium of exchange. It is perfectly possible for people to engage, right, in trade using something else as a medium of exchange if we wish, and we do see this happen sometimes. Another thing, though, that money does, because it is a commonly accepted medium of exchange, is that it serves as the unit of account. That is to say, when you do accounting, so you're calculating profit, calculating net worth, these types of things, you do so in whatever the dominant money happens to be, right? So in the United States, we use dollars to calculate profits, losses, assets, liabilities, net worth, and so on. Now, because of this, that means that money is really important for doing what we call economic calculation. So economic calculation is just where we're doing the comparison. It's effectively a profit or a prospective profit calculation to try to figure out what we're going to produce and how. A third role is that money becomes a standard of deferred payment. That is, if I'm going to get something now but pay later, I tend to pay in money. Now, this is very related to what we call legal tender laws. So, what a legal tender law does is it establishes a particular medium of exchange as being as being necessarily acceptable by law in debt repayment. So in the United States, if you look at a Federal Reserve note, it says, right, this note is, right, legal tender for payment of all debts, public and private. What that means then is that if you have a debt, then whoever it is that you have the debt to has to accept dollars to repay that debt. Now, notably, legal tender laws only apply to debt payments. They don't apply to spot payments. So it very well could be that, say, I don't know, I am having a garage sale or something like that, and people are stopping by buying things. I can actually refuse to take dollars in that situation as long as there's no debt involved. So I could say, no, I'm only accepting payment in oranges. That is something that I could do legally. It would be weird, but nonetheless, you can do it. So legal tender laws really only apply to debt repayment, but the fact that they do establish something for debt repayment tends to make whatever it is very useful as a medium of exchange in other transactions, and therefore tends to help it have that medium of exchange monetary role. And then finally, we have money serves as a store of value. That is to say, it carries value across time. Now, this doesn't mean that it carries value perfectly across time. After all, inflation happens. We know that uh, dollars have lost a significant amount of value over the course of the past 100 years, but nonetheless, we do expect it to maintain some level of value over time. It's not going to immediately become worthless at the, say, at the same rate that milk does if it's left out. So then, given these various functions that money plays, right, those four functions: a medium of exchange, a unit of account, a means of or standard for deferred payment, and then a store of value. It, that gives us some idea of what traits would be desirable for money to have. Right, so first thing, we want to make sure that money is heavily or widely demanded. That is, if lots of people want it, that makes it much more desirable as money. If it's something that only a few people want, then it's probably not going to make a good money. It's going to be hard to get it off the ground and being commonly accepted as a medium of exchange. A second trait would be portability. So that is that it has to have a high value for its weight and a high value for its bulk. So the reason for this is that historically, we know that a lot of the purchasing that we do, we have to say go from wherever we are, right, to a marketplace. So that there's a traveling involved. Because of that traveling, we need to have a money that can actually travel with us in a reasonable way. A third trait is durability. After all, if it's going to be a store of value over time, we want to make sure that the thing itself does not physically degrade in a significant way, or at least not quickly, over time. A fourth is what we call fungibility. Fungibility simply means that you can that any particular unit of that good is the same as any other unit of that good. It's for this reason that diamonds tend not to be a very good money, and they're extremely valuable. People like them, they're very durable. But they have the problem that no two diamonds are quite the same. They're different in terms of their quality, in terms of their size, and all of this. That makes it very hard to say, well, yeah, these two diamonds are basically the same, so it doesn't matter which one we have. That's not true, right? Because of that, that tends to make diamonds not best in terms of money. Instead, what we want is a money that is fungible, that is something where one unit of it is the same as any other unit. And then finally, divisibility. Right? So we need to have a money that can be cut down into smaller and smaller pieces, right? So that we can, in fact, trade it without it losing value in any kind of significant way. And this is where, like I said, cows are a problem. Cows are not divisible. Two halves of a cow are not the same as a whole cow. So what types of money do we see then? There are really primarily two types of money that we see used in history. Now, there's a third type of money we see very rarely, we call credit money, but let's focus on the main two. The first one is commodity money. So, commodity money is money that has some kind of non monetary value as well. Historically, it was typically precious metals, right? So, something like gold, we know gold certainly has been used as money historically, but at the same time, it has other uses apart from being a money, right? So, I can take gold, we can make jewelry out of it, for example. We can take gold, we can use it to uh, make other decorative items, or nowadays we can use gold in electronics, right? So we have all types of uses that gold can have outside of its monetary uses. The second type of money is fiat money. Now, modern monies in the world today, right, are fiat money. Now, in order to define the fiat money, it's just that this is a money that does not have any non-monetary value. So the US dollar would be a rather obvious case here. Now, there is also another class of what we call money substitutes. So, money substitutes are things that are not money, but nonetheless can serve a role like money. The reason for this is that these money substitutes have some connection to the actual money. And so we divide this up into two types, what we call money certificates. A money certificate is fully backed by money, and then fiduciary media are only partially backed by money. Now, an obvious case of a money substitute in the modern economy would be something like a check. Right? So when I write a check, the check itself is not money. It is not going to be generally accepted as a medium of exchange. Uh, so I'm not going to expect to see my checks right floating around there. Nonetheless, right, it can be used as money. So I can write a check to, I don't know, my furnace technician or something like that. I write a check to him. He's willing to accept it precisely because it can be handed in right to the bank for money. That is, it is convertible into money. So when we look at the evolution of money in the United States, go back to the early days. Now, this is certainly not going to be comprehensive. It's just giving us broad strokes of how we got to the point where we are today. Right. So in the early United States, gold and silver tended to be used as money, either directly or more often as a gold or silver backed note or coins. And so over time, we did find that gold did come to dominate, right? So there was a point in time where, while we were mostly using paper dollars, those paper dollars were redeemable in gold. So there was a point in time where it was approximately $20, $21 or so. If you had $20, $21, you could hand them in and then get a 1 ounce of a 1 ounce gold coin. Right? Even today, if you get a 1 ounce gold coin, it is printed with $20, right, as the monetary value of it, even though its actual gold value is far above that. But then something happened. April 5th, 1933. Uh, at this point in time, right, we're in the Great Depression, things are looking really bad, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt orders that people are no longer allowed to hold monetary gold. Right? So it places limits on people's ability to hold just the amount of gold, and certainly you're not allowed to hold monetary gold, so you cannot have gold coins. And the problem that he was facing at the time that he was trying to solve is that there was a run on gold in bank reserves. So I mentioned fiduciary media before, and this is the way that banks would often operate, that you only have a fraction of the gold that you would need, right, to back, say, people's checking accounts, that kind of thing. You only keep a fraction of it in reserve. We call this fractional reserve banking. And then if people come and they want the gold out, right, they hand you the check or whatever it happens to be for whatever the amount of gold is, and then you hand the gold in. The problem is that because they only held a fraction of the gold necessary, you had serious problems, so potentially in the banking system. We'll talk about this later on in the video. This is what we would call a liquidity crisis. And so, because of this issue of not having enough gold in bank reserves to satisfy as much as people would like to hold, right, we needed to find a way to break the tie between the substitutes that people were holding, these gold certificates, and the underlying money, that is the gold itself. Right, so that is exactly what FDR was doing here by saying, no, you're not allowed to hold monetary gold. Okay, technically, gold is still money, but you have to keep it in the bank, which means effectively, domestically, and the US dollar became basically a fiat currency. It was still nominally backed by gold, but you weren't actually allowed to hold the gold itself. As a result, we're basically stuck with the paper. However, there was still a real connection between the US dollar and gold for those that lived internationally, right? So, because gold is not illegal to hold, say, in Germany or in France, if we have people in Germany or France that end up with dollars, they can hand these dollars in and get the gold. So, we still have this potential problem out there. And it's this problem that led, almost 40 years after FDR's plan, to Nixon having to do what we call close the gold window in August of 1971. The problem that we had here was what we call dollar overhang. So, dollar overhang was that there were so many dollars abroad that if everyone tried to hand in their dollars for the gold that was backing it, we literally did not have enough gold just for those dollars that were held internationally. So this meant we were effectively looking at the problem of a run on gold. So Nixon did very much like FDR had done a few decades before, said, well, we're no longer allowing redemption in gold. Right? So no longer is there any tie between the dollar and gold. Whether you're domestic, foreign, it doesn't really make any difference. Right? There is no tie between the dollar and gold at this point. So here is where the US did finally establish a pure fiat currency. So how then do we measure money? There are two common definitions that are used. So the first is the more narrow definition, what we call M1, because the M1 money stock is composed of three main components. Right? That is currency in circulation, demand deposits. Demand deposits is just the technical term for checking accounts, and then other liquid deposits. So by liquid, we simply mean that it's easy for you to take money out of them. So this would include, say, other checking accounts, say things like traveler's checks and the like, where it's not quite the same as normal checking account. Also, savings accounts now are included as part of M1. That is something that was a regulatory change that happened. I forget the exact year, but it was sometime after 2020 that this occurred. Where it used to be that savings accounts were not considered to be a liquid deposit because there were actually regulations saying that you were not allowed to withdraw money from a savings account more than 4 times over the course of a month without there being some kind of penalty or fee attached to it. But that regulation was eliminated, which made savings accounts then much more liquid than they previously had been. So they were moved into the M1 money stock. We'll see what this looks like in terms of the level of M1 in a minute. It turns out that made a huge difference. Then a second broader definition is what we call M2 money stock. So M2 money stock includes everything in M1, but then adds to it two other types of money that are less liquid. Right? So one would be retail money market funds. Right? So a money market fund is one where when you put money into this account, that money is then used to buy investments. So technically, what's happening here is that you're not actually putting money on deposit. Instead, you're using it to buy shares of a mutual fund. It's just this mutual fund is buying very safe investments, or at least by design is supposed to buy very safe investments so that you're probably not going to lose anything on it. And then normally these money market mutual funds are regulated, or not regulated, but are run in such a way that one share is always equal to $1. But legally, that's not really what's happening. Instead, when I cash in a money market mutual fund, I am actually selling my shares, right? So it's a little bit different than, say, money that's sitting in a savings account. The other one would be small denomination time deposits. So these would be certificates of deposit, but for less than, I believe it's $100,000 is the cutoff. So the idea here is we want to keep it small enough that it's probably individuals that are holding these rather than businesses that are holding these. Then time deposits, certificates of deposit have this trait where if you cash them in early, you do have to pay a penalty. So they're definitely not as liquid as a savings account. Now, one really important note, given the importance of plastic in today's economy, now I don't mean plastic, the substance, but rather plastic as in form of payment, debit cards and credit cards. The two of them actually have no impact on the money supply. Right? So a debit card, it just pulls from any checkable deposit, right? So say I have a checking account, I also have a debit card. When I use the debit card, it automatically pulls from my checking account, right? So the money there, any money that's deposited that I can then spend using my debit card, it's counted in M1 because it's a checkable deposit. Because it's an M1, it's also an M2. A credit card, however, is a little bit different in that it's a debt instrument, right? So when I run my credit card and use that to pay for something, it's now creating a debt that I have to pay. But the existence of debt, right, doesn't by itself have any impact on M1 or M2, right? So it's just a loan from the credit card company that then I have promised to repay. Here's what M1 and M2 look like over time. And you can see when the redefinition happened. Right, so the dotted line that's above, that would be M2, because M2 includes M1, so by nature it has to be bigger than M1. And then the solid line that lies underneath would be M1. And you can see right there in 2020, there was the COVID recession, and right toward the end of the COVID recession, that's the gray bar that's vertical there, we saw this huge jump in M1. That's not the creation of new money. That is instead the introduction of the idea that M1 should include savings accounts. So we had accounts that were very large, were not included in M1 in 2019, but were included by the time we get to the end of 2020. Now let's talk more about banks and how they have a connection to the monetary system. Now, banks by nature are what we call financial intermediaries. That is, they stand in the middle of the financial system. Right? So you have savers on the one hand that are making deposits to the bank, or perhaps are making loans to the bank, and then in return they're receiving payments if they are lenders, or they're receiving interest on the deposits they make. So in my case, I have some savings accounts, and they earn not a lot of interest, but they do earn some interest. Banks then take this money and lend it out to a borrower. So banks make these loans, and in return for making those loans, those that receive the loan pay them back with interest over time. And so it's really banks standing between, on the one hand, savers, and on the other hand, borrowers. So why do we have financial intermediaries? Why don't we just directly, right, fund things? Well, there are a few reasons for this. One being that it lowers transaction cost. Because the reality is, anytime that I want to save, if I had to say, okay, I want to save this for a long period of time, now I need to go find something to invest in. Right? I want to find somebody that's willing to borrow from me for the period of time in which I want to lend to them. That's something that's going to be really hard to do. So it's going to be very costly to make this transaction happen. So that's what we call transaction cost. Tends to be quite high if you want to do an exact match. But having a bank there, I just put the money in the bank, they're the ones that then go out and find people to lend to. In fact, they tend not even to have to go out. People come to them, right, to borrow. Right, so that does lower the transaction cost significantly by creating these institutions that are designed with this purpose in mind of connecting the saver with the borrower. Another thing they do is pooling and diversification, right? So, say I'm taking out a mortgage. Let's say the mortgage is $200,000, right? So for me to find somebody that will lend me $200,000, that's quite a bit. And that's asking a lot. Right? Now, it would be really nice if instead of doing that, I could say borrow, say, 1,000 from one person, 1,000 from another person, 1,000 from another person, and so on. And eventually, over 200 people, I get my loan funded. And that is exactly the kind of thing that banks do. Right? So they would compile or pool all of the various savings from the various depositors, and then they can allow them to have larger loans that way. Another thing that happens is diversification. So thinking of it the other way, as a depositor, when I make investments, I don't want to put all of my eggs in one basket, as they say. Right? Instead, I want to divide up my money so that it's in lots of different investments. And it's again exactly what banks do, right? So they take money from lots of different investors, they combine it all into one big pool, and then they take that one big pool and divide it up amongst lots of different investments, right? So this is the way that we think of financial intermediation really playing a significant role. A third role would be time transformation. That is, sometimes I want to have money that I'm saving for a short period of time, but at the same time, somebody else wants a mortgage for 30 years. So one of the things that banks do is they effectively try to arrange so that the 30-year mortgage gets lent out, but just doing a series of very short borrowings that the banks themselves are handling, right? So say I put money in my checking account, part of that then gets lent out to somebody as a mortgage, even though I'm still using my checking account to pay for stuff, as long as the payments are coming in and everything is well managed by the bank, this really isn't causing a problem. So let's think about kind of the way that bank balance sheets work, right? So like any balance sheet, you have two sides. You have the asset side and the liability side. The asset side would be those things that the bank owns. So there are a few different categories that these fall under. First, you would have securities. So securities are usually U.S. Government bonds for a bank. So that is, they're lending money to the government through purchasing bonds, and then they hold these bonds in their portfolio. That appears as securities. There are also loans. Now that is whenever the money lends money, whenever the money gets lent out by the bank, right, to others, then that claim, right, on that other person, the loan, right, is an asset to the bank that that money is owed to. So for example, my mortgage is a liability to me because I owe it, but it's a asset to my bank because they own it. The third category would be what we call reserves or just cash. I think it's fairly obvious what that is, right? That is, banks do in fact hold some significant cash on hand. And then finally, there's just this other category. Usually, this captures things like buildings, certain other investments that don't fit neatly into the other categories, right? So all of the assets fall really into these four categories. On the right side of the balance sheet, where you have liabilities, this would be what the bank owes. And it really mostly takes two forms. First, the form of deposits, that is, when I put money into my checking account, now the bank owes me that money back. So it is effectively like I'm giving a very short term loan to the bank. A second thing would be borrowings, and that is when the bank is actually borrowing money right from others. Then finally, we have just this other category. It tends to be fairly small, and these would be things like outstanding bills and that kind of stuff. So a very small amount of liabilities would fall into this other category. And finally, you have net worth. A net worth is just the difference between assets and liabilities. This, in bank terms, is called bank capital. So here's just what the banking system looks like as of September 2025. Right, so you can see the breakdown of securities, loans, interbank loans, cash assets, and other assets for a total of $24.5 trillion of assets in the banking system in the United States. Liabilities here broken down between deposits, borrowings, and other, with $2.4 trillion of bank capital. So roughly 10%, right, of the assets are held in capital. Also, when you look at the breakdown, just a note, the assets are primarily loans to borrowers, and when you look at the liabilities, they are primarily deposits. So most of what the banking system does is take deposits and then lend them out to somebody else, exactly as we've described. Now let's talk about how things go wrong. Right, so we want to look at two different types of bank crisis. Right, so the first one is what we call a liquidity crisis. A liquidity crisis, another term for that is a bank run, right? So this would be a case where lots of people come and want to withdraw money from their accounts at the same time. So there are a couple good examples of this when you look at media. Number one, boy, I've loved banking since I was a child. Mary Poppins was one of my favorite movies, still is one of my favorite movies. And there's this great scene of a bank run where one of the kids says, "No, give me back my money," and the bank is kind of hesitant to do so, and this leads everyone to try to take their money back out. Now, this is a problem because after all, we just saw that the banking system doesn't hold a lot in reserve. Instead, most of the money that's put in, right, is lent out to other people. So they simply can't give everybody the cash all at once. Now, generally speaking, a liquidity crisis is brought on by a lack of confidence in the banking system. Now, another thing that can happen, though, is that there can be a time mismatch. That is, if banks are using checking account money to make 30-year mortgages, there is always the possibility that, say, I might need to empty my checking account to pay for something, but I want to do that faster than 30-year mortgages are being paid off. So we get this time mismatch where the cash just isn't available. It eventually will be available once people pay off their mortgages, and this is explained by Jimmy Stewart, of course, in It's a Wonderful Life. He says, no, you're acting like the money's all here in a safe. It's not. It's in so-and-so's house, so-and-so's house, so-and-so's house. They'll pay you off as they can, right? But we can end up with this time mismatch if people have the ability to get money out immediately while at the same time the money doesn't come in except over time. The second type of crisis is what we call a solvency crisis. A solvency crisis is when a bank has a negative net worth or negative bank capital. Right, so what that means then is that even when all of the loans are paid off, they still don't have enough, right, to cover all of their liabilities. Usually this would be caused by lots of loans going bad. If a loan goes bad, it stops being an asset, but it also doesn't get paid off, right? So it doesn't convert into cash or anything like that. Now, ideally, this is something that diversification should be able to help, and inevitably, some loans are going to go bad. This is not avoidable. What is avoidable is having lots of loans go bad if we actually diversify our investments. Now, it turns out these two crises are not totally separate. Each of them can lead to the other as well, right? So, for example, if you have a liquidity crisis, lots of people want money at the same time. Well, what could you do to try to solve this problem? Well, one, calling in loans is really hard to do. We may talk about that in a later video in the series, but getting people to pay loans early, that's generally difficult, often a bad idea. But one thing I could do is take the securities that I have and sell them. I have a bunch of government bonds. I can go out, I can sell these government bonds. That can raise some cash quickly. The problem is, if this is a systemic issue and everyone is just trying to sell at the same time, that's going to lower the value of those things. So if an increase in supply happens, the price falls. So it's very possible you might see asset values falling significantly, and it could be enough at times to eliminate the bank's capital, so you end up with a solvency crisis at the end. It can also cut the other way, right? If banks are insolvent, then we know that they can't repay all of their liabilities. If that's true, depositors can get very nervous. They say, well, okay, I know you can't possibly pay everyone back. Well, I want to make sure I get paid back, right? So we end up with a run on the bank, people trying to withdraw money as quickly as possible, much more than is available at that point in time. So these huge withdrawals lead to a liquidity crisis precisely because of the lack of confidence in the system. The banks also are connected with money through the money creation process. Right? So banks create money through fractional reserve banking. So let's just walk through the process. Now, I'm going to simplify the idea of the money supply so that the money supply is really just these two things: is cash in circulation plus deposits. That's it. Now we know, of course, with M1 and M2, exactly which deposits count is a question, but I'm just keeping it simple. Cash and deposit. So suppose I have a $50 bill. So that would be cash in circulation. If I take that money and I put it in my checking account, that has no effect on the money supply at all. All I've done is convert money supply that's in cash in circulation that falls by $50 because it's no longer in circulation. Meanwhile, deposits rise by $50. So you have minus 50 plus 50 cancels out. There's no change in the money supply. Now what happens if the bank turns around and says, oh, we have $50 in the vault. Now we can give a loan. Okay. Once it lends that money out, like now it's back in circulation. So we have an increase in the money supply by $50. So in effect, this $50 bill, right, is double counted. It counts both as my deposit. My deposit's still there. It still counts as part of the money supply. And it also counts as cash in circulation since it was taken out of the bank by the bank when they lent it out. Right, so this then means that we have an additional $50 created by the lending process that the bank does. Now, this can happen again and again. After all, the person who borrowed that $50 is probably going to spend it. When they spend it, whoever receives it is probably going to deposit it. And again, that doesn't make any difference in terms of money supply, except now the bank has $50 again, it lends them out again. Right? So what that means is that the same base money, right, can be lent multiple times, resulting in it counting multiple times when we calculate the money supply. Right, so these ripples that happen through the loan market, this relending of deposits and then relending and relending creates a multiplier effect. Right, so there is a theoretical maximum on this. That is, if you take the money multiplier would be equal to 1 divided by the required reserve ratio, right, as a decimal. Now, banks will typically, while they will lend money out, they will typically hold on to what we call reserves. That is, they don't lend out every single dollar that comes in. Right, so for example, if there's a 10% required reserve ratio, right, the way this works is I put the $50 in, they don't lend all 50 out, they lend out 45, and that 45 comes in, they don't lend out all 45, they lend out like $40.50 and so on, right? So these ripples happen this way. Once you work all of these out and add it all up, the total money multiplier is going to be 1 divided by, take that 10%, express it as a decimal, 0.1, so it'd be 10. So you could end up with a money supply that is 10 times as large as what we call the monetary base, that is currency and bank reserves. Now, a very important note here is this 1 divided by the required reserve ratio, that is a maximum. In practice, we tend not to see ripples that are that big. Right? So big reasons being, one, cash holdings. That is, not every dollar gets put into the banking system to be relent. Right? Every dollar that is just held by people can't be relent, and that would bring down the money multiplier. Similarly, with excess reserves are reserves that banks hold they're not legally required to hold. Now, historically, this was very, very small, but this has not been the case recently. Over the past several years, banks are holding very large excess reserves, in part because the Fed has taken on what we call an ample reserve policy. That is, they're trying to provide banks with lots of reserves so that they can, I guess, feel comfortable with their level of reserves. Another thing that the Fed did was eliminate the reserve requirement. So technically now the required reserve ratio is literally zero. What that means then is if you do the math from the previous slide, okay, 1 divided by required reserve ratio is 0, well, you end up with infinity. Okay, that's not particularly useful. So I would say that so nowadays this idea of 1 over the required reserve ratio is the money multiplier. That was probably actually true around the year 2000, 2010 probably as well. These were, well, no, not 2010. 2010 was after the financial crisis. We were holding lots of reserves then. 2005, right? So 2000, 2005, this ratio was actually really close to accurate. Nowadays, it definitely is not, right? So rather than using the required reserve ratio, if we want to be more accurate, we would place this with something like a desired reserve ratio, as that banks, whether or not required to hold reserves, they are holding reserves. So plugging that in is a reasonable adjustment. So this should give us some idea of what money is, right? Some of how it works, how we measure it, and also the impact that banks have in their ability to create money. And also, it turns out the flip side of it, to destroy money. People pay off their loans and it doesn't get lent out again. That's less money out there. Right, so we'll wrap it here. Thank you for watching. All the best.